The House of Drear, Chapter 12, Part 1. Well then, said Mr. Small, we know a little more than we did an hour ago. He headed the car back toward town the way they had come. Car people, Darrow people, Mrs. Small said. I wonder what Mr. Pluto's family name is. Skinner, said Mr. Small. Who? How do you know that? Asked Thomas. I found out from the foundation the first trip I made here. Didn't I tell you? Mr. Small said. They told me his name is Henry Skinner. But is he the only Skinner? Mrs. Small wanted to know. Does he have family here? I never thought to ask, said Mr. Small. I suspect the car man would have said something if Pluto had family here. You could find out, Thomas said. You could go to the county seat, maybe. They keep records. I don't care to find out, Mr. Small said. Besides, Carr said Pluto came from somewhere else as a boy, and that there was bad blood between the old grandfather Darrow and him. I wonder why, Thomas said. Time may tell, Mr. Small said. Let's take things easy and wait a while. Look, said Mrs. Small. Look there. Isn't that a school? There was a drive off Highway 68 leading into an expanse of land on which sat a sprawling, ivy-covered school. Mr. Small drove down. Oh, that's pretty cool, said Thomas. It was called Washington Junior High and High School. It had a smooth lawn and a large playing field. To the right of it was a wide stream called the Little Miami River. Miami, Thomas said. That's in Florida. This whole area, both the town and country, is known as the Miami Valley, Mr. Small told him. Some comical folks like to call it the Sinus Valley because it has so much rain and snow. Boy, I bet there will be lots of sledding, said Thomas. I'm going to get me a big sled and whomp down every hill. Mr. Small turned the car around and went back to the highway. I want to see the rest of it, said Thomas. Please, Papa, I want to see the whole town. The twins were quiet, almost asleep. Mrs. Small said they could drive around for a while. Mr. Small chose a street at random. On one side of the street was a white house the size of a mansion with black trim. There was a huge lawn full of trees. There were swings and slides on both sides of the house. That's the grade school, said Mr. Small. What a lovely place for children to play, said Mrs. Small. Thomas could see paper cutouts of Easter rabbits in many of the school's windows. He felt happy. Everything seemed normal again. He didn't even feel very tired. He looked at all there was to see and kept on feeling so good he thought he would burst. It was a pretty town. People lived in nice houses, large and small. Some of the houses were quite old but well taken care of. They passed through what looked like a new section of town. Outside playing were many children still dressed in their Sunday clothes. Some houses had swings and slides in their backyards. Thomas thought they must be kindergartens, but no, Mr. Small said, they were homes. People could afford good playthings for their children, he said. People made good money. Thomas saw homes side by side where white and colored children played on the lawns together, and he saw houses on streets where you couldn't tell what kind of people might live in them. They turned onto a back road leading through farmland. They traveled the road for some time. There were many barns with cows. There were fenced-in areas with hog pens and hog houses. Fields were plowed. Large pools of water stood like silver ponds along fence lines. The sun made them sparkle. The gentle wind made shallow waves over their surfaces. The air was so pure, Thomas could have laughed out loud. He poked his head out of the window, letting his face brush the leaves of trees by the road. You could live forever here, he thought. Forever and ever. You could get a bicycle and let all kinds of dogs chase after you down these roads. Soon, they found themselves on the divided highway that passed by the house of Drear. Time to get home, said Mr. Small. He looked at his watch. Why, it's almost 5:30. We've been fooling around almost the whole afternoon. I want to get to my room, said Thomas. I want to take off these shoes and unpack my school clothes. I've got to register for school next week, don't I, Papa? I've got to get me some school supplies. I'll need to buy curtain material, Mrs. Small said to no one in particular. Goodness, I'll need a lot of those for all those high windows. Bye, said Mr. Small. All you think about is buying. Wait until I see some salary before you two start to buy. You're always crying dollar poor, said Mrs. Small to him. I know how much is in that bank. But you don't know which bank, said Mr. Small, smiling. I bet you don't know that. I do, said Thomas. I saw the bank book on your dresser. The Miami Savings and Loan Bank. That's the name. You're supposed to be on my side, Mr. Small told him. I have to get my school supplies, Thomas said. I've got to be on Mama's side. Mr. Small turned the car onto the road leading up to the house of Drear. The road had dried somewhat from the sun, and another day it would be completely dried out. The sun lay above the trees on top of the hill behind the house. The sky was almost clear blue, with only the slightest sign of night in it. They grew quiet in the car. The twins were sleeping. Poor dears, Mrs. Small said. They can't imagine what's happening to them. They crossed over the bridge. Almost at once, Thomas felt their isolation from all things ordinary. They were so cut off from the highway, from the town, from all life that was normal, they might as well have been locked in a closet. The dark and silent house looming over them had already reached out for them and was pulling them in. Thomas could feel it turning him cold all over. You've got to fight back at it, he told himself. You've just got to keep being warm inside and not let it get through you. Like intruders, they went silently into the house. The house seemed to listen to their uncertain tread. It seemed to watch them, pressing close as if trying to overhear, but they were silent. Thomas and Mrs. Small tiptoed upstairs with the twins. The night light still burned in their room. Just take off their coats, whispered Mrs. Small, and their stockings and shoes. These are their Sunday clothes, Mama, Thomas whispered back. Do as I say, said Mrs. Small. I don't want to disturb them by taking clothes off and putting clothes on. Thomas did as he was told, although he didn't like it one bit. Babies shouldn't have to go to bed in their Sunday suits, he thought. It's like they're ready to run away in case something bad happens. Like they don't belong here. This old house thinks it's going to get them, thinks it's got all of us on the run. I'll be patrolling this hall tonight. No, sir, this old house will be sorry if it tries to scare my babies. One of the twins whimpered in his sleep and shivered as with a chill. Quickly, Thomas leaned over him. He covered Buster, putting his arm around him. Thomas stayed close until the child breathed silently, until the bedding was warm. Then he and Mrs. Small left the room, tiptoeing down the hall and down the stairs. They had looked from one closed door to the other, going down the hall. They were on their guard. Mr. Small stood in the doorway of the kitchen. The way he stood, so still there, caused Thomas and Mrs. Small to come quickly. He let Thomas through, but tried to bar Mrs. Small's way. You let me through, she told him. Let me by. Don't look, Mr. Small said. Please, let Thomas and me. But Mrs. Small pushed by him. What she saw caused her to cover her face with her hands. A choked cry came from deep inside her, but that was all. She stood there without saying a word, with her eyes tight closed and her hands covering them. Nothing Thomas could imagine, not all the devilment of strangers, of bad boys older and more daring than himself, could have prepared him for the sight of the kitchen. Looking at it, he was overcome with dread and loneliness. He reached out for his mother and put his arm around her. Mrs. Small swayed and leaned against Thomas. The large sack of flour Mr. Pluto had bought for them had been emptied over the entire kitchen floor. It had been spread evenly in a layer, and over the layer had been poured water and apple juice. The whole mess had been mixed into a sticky brown paste, which was spread over the kitchen table, over the stove and sink counters, over all the chairs and over parts of the walls. The door of the Frigidaire hung open, and all the food there had been removed. Whatever could be squeezed had been squeezed onto the floor. What could be poured had been poured out in swirls on the floor. What dishes had remained after Thomas's fall of the night before were broken in the sink with the same sticky paste covering them. The whole room, the windows, everything glistened with this unspeakable icing. Over it all was a warm odor of rotting food. The only canned goods that had not been punctured and emptied into the sink were the cans of evaporated milk used for the baby's bottles. Thomas let go of his mother and took a step into the room. No, said Mr. Small, leave it be. His voice was low with an edge to it, rough as jagged rock. Thomas didn't have to turn around to know what his face looked like. They mean to make us run with this, Mr. Small said. They thought to terrify you so, he said to Mrs. Small, that there would be nothing for us to do but run. Oh, Walter, Mrs. Small whispered. We could move into town. We would be safe. Is that all we're made of, he said. Are we to let fools run us out of this historic house, our home? We're better than that. Oh, yes. Whoever thought to make us run doesn't know what we are made of. Thomas, he said, you come with me. Martha, you go up with the twins. Make bottles for them. Turn on the light up there if you want. Lock yourself in with them, but stay there until we get back. I'm going to get to the bottom of this right now. And before this night is done, somebody, some fool, is going to catch it. Mr. Small and Thomas saw her to the room. They made her lock the door from the inside before they left her. They had given her a small table lamp, which would give her light to see the whole room without disturbing the twins. All right now, Mr. Small called through the door. Yes, she said, whispering. Yes, you can go. We're going. Don't be afraid. I don't think they will come back." "Oh, I'm sure of that," she whispered. She heard them leave. She wasn't sure of anything, but she took a deep breath and smoothed her hair behind her ears. "All right, ghosts," she whispered. "Come right on in. If you can work over my kitchen, I can surely work over your head." She sat down to wait with Thomas, baseball bat resting delicately across her knees.